All right, we got this Monstera. It's definitely ready for a moss pole. We're gonna pull it out, see how the roots look. It might need a bigger pot, very likely, in fact. Let's see. Monsteras, in their native habitats, all they want to do is climb a tree. And so as juveniles, they grow these really huge, massive root systems, and they get really wild, and they grow sort of in all kinds of directions in an attempt to hit the base of a tree. So the sooner that we get them mounted, the sooner that we're sort of stopping that really expansive growth. And we see this guy. He's just got like so much root, and there's multiple stems here, and they're going all different directions because this is desperately looking for something to climb on. So the moss pole is specifically designed to mimic the sort of porosity and humidity that the tree bark of a tropical tree would have. And when the plant senses that the bark is there, it'll grab into it, and then it will instinctively stop producing as much root and vine, and instead will focus on upward growth. So much easier to take care of. The leaves get bigger, and it's more tidy. They grow straight up rather than all over the place. So, folks, when you get your first Monstera, as soon as it starts to get it on a moss pole, bring it in. Let us put it on a moss pole for you. Then your pots will stay so much smaller, and you'll have room for more plants. They do definitely want to grow on trees. They're trying to rise above other plants in the environment, and then they grow big, huge leaves to absorb as much sunlight as possible. And then they think that the slits and the fenestrations in the leaves are to help prevent them being damaged in like wind and rainstorms, because they can also have some pretty intense weather in those climates. So if they didn't have holes in the leaves would probably get really beat up during those tropical storms. These roots look pretty good. There's a little bit of rot in the middle that I'm working on pulling out right now. But largely it looks pretty good. These kind of brown crispy spots are usually indicating that there is root stress of some kind. It has to do with oxygen, mostly has to do with oxygen deprivation, and that can come from rot, come from dryness, and come from binding. The source of that oxygen deprivation can be many things. The most common is some kind of root stress. You're getting bruisey, kind of blobular. I just invented that word, globular. Discoloration on the leaves, especially if it's not the ones closest to the bottom, the roots need some attention in one way or another. So if you've got blobs, call Jen, call Urban Sprouts. Bring them. Lobusters, yes. So this plant has quite a bit of root decay, actually. It's not super advanced, so that tells me likely what happened is it outgrew its spot. And then as a result, the roots were taking up all of the soil space, and then the soil wasn't able to serve the roots in the way that they needed. So it started leading to rot. It probably got a little bit too dry, or it was affected by some change in temperature. And so we've got some pretty extensive early stage decay that we need to pull away. But I can probably get it all back into its original pot now, and then we'll mount it and we'll trim it up, and it'll look much better. Hopefully, once it's back in its pot, the roots will start recovering, and then within 6 months or so, hopefully it'll outgrow its pot again, and then we'll be able to go up a size, and it should also be taken to its pole by that point too. Okay, the roots, I'm feeling confident that whatever's left on it now is healthy, so we're gonna put it back in here. If the roots were fully intact, I'm almost positive that it would have needed a bigger pot, but since we had quite a bit of decay to remove, this is an appropriate size for a while. Put it in the pot. Now put a moss pole in there. The size of the moss pole is determined by how tall the plant is. This one, if it had totally healthy roots, I might go for a 48, but I went with a 36 since it still has recovering roots, because we're probably going to need to redo it all in about 6 months once the roots are back in shape. So if this is a 36-inch, so it's a healthy Monstera that was about where the vine was about 2 feet long, I would opt for a 36. If this one was totally healthy, these vines are each about 3 feet tall, so I would go for a 4 or a 5, but it's a little different when they're in recovery. We have redesigned these moss bowls a lot, and it's been figuring out what works. So these ones have a really dirty core. It's got a nice wooden stake in the bottom that is still organic, so it's not going to disrupt the roots by leaching like plastic or metal chemicals into the soil, but they last longer. And then there's a soft, mossy interior that helps the aerial roots penetrate into it once it gets past the outside layer, which is like a cocoa mat, which helps. It's the right texture that the plant's looking for to grab into. And it's not messy. Some of our earlier designs didn't have this outside like cocoa mat layer, and they worked really well, but they just shed a little bit. And this one is just cleaner and more aesthetic while serving the purpose that it needs to. When I'm mounting, I like to use just like a really soft jute twine. I find that it is a very similar texture to the moss pole itself, so it is gentle and holds the plant in place. And if the plant grows and the tie is still in place, it's biodegradable enough and soft enough that the plant can kind of help dislodge it, but it's not going to do that unless it's somehow compromised. The string is somehow compromised. Once the plant takes to the moss pole, you won't need the strings anymore, so they can be removed. Some plants will dig into their moss poles pretty immediately, and some will take months or even years. Just individuals, you know. Everybody is a little bit different. Everybody takes to their moss poles at different rates. The tricky part about doing this is knowing how to position all the vines along the pole so that they're getting optimal contact, but also not snapping them. So the skill here comes from feeling the tension and knowing where and how to bend. Some of these are going to really need some straightening out. But I almost never snap branches anymore. I'm not going to say never, because that seems like a jinx, but it very rarely happens, because I can just feel it. I've done it a lot, lots of practice. I really encourage people to start mounting their Monsteras as soon as they start extending upwards. Like as soon as there are a couple of nodes showing above the soil level, because the earlier the plant finds its tree, the sooner you can kind of contain that root growth. In the store, we have 2 resident Monsteras. We have an Albo and a Thai Constellation. Both are mounted, but the Albo was mounted much younger. So it's in like a 10-inch pot, and it's like, I don't know, it's probably about 7 or 8 feet tall now. And that was mounted probably when it was about 2 feet tall, versus the Thai Constellation was a little bit later. And so its pot is probably like a 14-inch, even though it's about the same height. It's so much easier when the pots are smaller. It's less heavy. You can water a little bit more frequently without worrying about root rot. So like right now, this bend is super strenuous. So I'm gonna let it sit in this position for a little bit before I pull anymore, because it's in that not quite ready to snap, but if I pull it wrong, it'll snap. But I'll probably be able to straighten it out today. They always look a little bit wonky when I first finish mounting, because the leaves are all in all different directions. But if you've just had your Monstera mounted, you'll want to face the front of the plant towards whatever your brightest light source in your home is for a few days. And that will encourage all the leaves to reorient, face that light source, and it'll just make everything look really full and beautiful. It doesn't have to necessarily live in that spot, but putting it there at first will help acclimate it to the pole. And it might look a little bit wobbly at the moment, but I haven't finished topping off the soil yet. So I want to keep it really flexible while I'm mounting. So I'll put the final layer of soil on after I finish this, which will sturdy this up. The two most common things that I see with Monstera, this type of browning is really common, but it's from either just the soil getting too dry or just being watered too frequently. So it is a tropical plant and it can tolerate the soil drying out, but it definitely prefers to not quite get all the way dried out between waterings. I always recommend about a 3/4 dry out if possible, like 3/4 to just fully dried. That sustained dried out soil can lead to hydrophobic soil pretty quickly, which basically means that the soil's gotten so dry that when you apply water, it repels it instead of absorbing it. So a lot of the time people let the plant get a little bit too dry and then they apply water, but the soil's not retaining it, so it just passes right through. And then the person, they're like, oh, I watered the plant, it's fine, but the plant's just not getting that water because the soil's not accepting it. So the best way to avoid it is to not let the soil get too dried out. Or what I personally like to do is just to check and make sure that my plants aren't hydrophobic about once a season or so. Any of my kind of more arid-ish tropical plants, I'll soak the whole pot in water for like an hour just to, like, through osmosis, force water into the soil if it has gotten too dry. When you're watering, as long as you're allowing it to dry out properly each time, there's no such thing as too much water. There's just too frequently applied water. See, told you I could do it. One of the main things that we do here is find the intersection between what is best for your plants and what works best for you as a caretaker. And if you find yourself to be on the nurturing side, we can change the material or the soil of your plant so that it dries out faster so that you can love on it a little bit more. And in fact, if you are able to water more frequently without rotting your plant out, it will reward you with faster, better growth. It's just, you just got to find that point. And that's where knowing about soil and soil ecology and materials and how plants grow, like what we know here, comes into play, because we can take all those factors and sort of create and tweak formulas for your setups that make it so that your care style matches what your plant is getting. All right, that one's not going to bend. It's not ready. So it's going to stay like that for a few days, and then I'll try to bend it again. But we can start trimming leaves now. Primarily, you're going to trim for aesthetic value. In this case, like sometimes I'll trim away at the leaf and decide, like, is this leaf something that I want to look at all the time? Is it adding to the plant by still being there? This particular one actually still has a little bit of edema damage, which is this sort of like reddish discoloration. It's when a plant cell becomes over engorged with water, it can burst and cause sort of this reddish discoloration. The most famous of which comes from fiddle leaf figs. Will have these like really bright red veins in the new growth when that happens. But you choose mostly based on aesthetics. I generally start by trimming the damage away, and then once I've trimmed everything, I'll decide if a leaf is worth keeping or not. Leaves that have a fair amount of yellowing in them are also pretty likely to die off. So it can even be like a temporary thing to have them still there. But sometimes it's nice to just have it still look nice and full for a while until the plant is able to use up the nutrients in that leaf. And then when it dies off, you can just trim it off.